there are a bunch of buildings in EU4, and it's time to rank them in the only objective way possible, a tier list. One of the comments that I've received a lot has been a request to show on screen the modifiers for the things that I'm putting in a tier list. And I've been avoiding doing that since I also get a lot of comments about how you guys basically just listen to these. Meaning I'm a bit worried about having information be lost for those that are basically using these tier lists as background music. So today I'll be showing some information on screen, such as the direct effect of the buildings, or the tech necessary to unlock the building, or in some cases, for the manufacturers, how they interact with specific trade goods. Despite that, I hope to still convey that information verbally, so if you're planning on just listening to this, you should still be getting 100% of the information. At least that's the plan. So anyway, feel free to shout at me in the comments, although again, you tend to do that anyway. With that said, before we begin, the usual things would be appreciated. A like on the video would be great if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing. We're coming up real close now to 10k subs, and that would be an insane milestone to reach. Anyway, enough self-shitting. Let's begin with a quick intermission on trade company buildings. I won't be putting them on a tier list, but basically when money is still a problem, build harbours, that's the trade power and production efficiency one, local ventures, that's the more production efficiency one and local goods produced one, and don't bother the other ones until you make so much money you don't care about any. At which point, go get the other ones so that the pop-up that you can invest in a trade company goes away. For even more money, grab property appraisers for the trade steering or townships for the trade value modifiers on the end nodes. Anyway, time for the actual tier lists, where we begin with courthouses. I like courthouses. You don't build them for money, even though technically they count as an economic building because of the state maintenance reduction they provide. State maintenance is a bit of a joke with how pathetic it can be. The thing is with courthouses is they were kind of meh, but they've been slowly buffed to be honestly quite amazing. The monthly autonomy change on them is, I mean, it's a nice quality of life and it's a decent amount of it, 0.1, and it can definitely help for prolonged periods of low crown land and prolonged war when you don't have the peacetime taken, but it is what it is. The big thing is, of course, the province governing cost reduction 25%. That's quite nice, and I think that's quite good. The main thing with them, of course, is they can be upgraded to town halls, and when you have town halls in every single province, you can basically govern twice as much land. But we're talking about courthouses here. They're quite good. The thing that's, I think, slightly holding them back is 25% province governing cost. For me, is not quite the part where a combination of courthouse plus the manufacturing means you can basically not worry about GovCap. However, it just helps you deal with GovCap in the early game. Although, again, you can't really afford to put it in every single province that early on when you unlock them because they're quite unlocked quite early at Admin 8. 100 ducats is pretty much the default cost for a building from the early part of the game, so that's up to around 10 to 15-ish area, so nothing too special there. And the other thing that's nice with them is, much like universities, they come with their own building stock, so they don't cost you one of those. Basically, you build this if you're low on GovCap. The problem is, a lot of the time, in multiplayer, you're going to be low on GovCap because you're deving everything to the moon. And in single player, you're going to struggle with GovCap because you're trying to conquer the entire world. So for me, courthouses are definitely a very, very solid thing. My only reservations about the top tiers is, of course, that, well, a lot of buildings are really good. So I have to really reserve a lot of the top tiers for things that really, really shine. And for me, courthouses are just a very excellent building. So into A tier they go. And we move on now to town halls. The upgraded courthouse. It's just an objectively better building, and the thing is with town halls, by the time you get to them at Admin 22, you're going to have enough money, or you should have enough money if you know what you're doing, as well as the ability to build a manufactory for another province governing cost reduction to basically full state the entire world. Full stating the entire world is incredibly powerful, and you should definitely try it sometime if you haven't. It gives you loads of money, loads of manpower, basically fixes most of the problems that you're interacting with that aren't monarch points, and even then, because you're making so much money, you're probably going to be able to afford advisors. 50% province governing costs combined with a upgraded, the upgraded manufacturing is going to give you minus 90% province governing cost overall, meaning that you're basically literally not going to have to struggle with governing cost at all. You are going to probably want to invest in something like administrative anyway for both the CCR, but beyond that, you're fine. In multiplayer, they're technically less relevant since by the time you actually get them by Admin 22, most games tend to be over, so you're not able to utilize them fully. But even then, if games do go on late enough to the situation where you are building town halls, they're incredibly good. And simply because of their ability to allow you to not have to worry about GovCap, I have to put town halls into S tier because of just how good they are. With that said, though, we move on to universities. I love universities and love dev cost. 20% local dev cost is a beautiful modifier to have and a truly nice one that you can never get out of the way. Very few missions give you universities, but a couple do, and when they do, it is amazing and you love it. A building stock from them definitely does not hurt as well, meaning that you can basically shove them onto everything as well. Never a complaint there. If, however, for the record, you are ever in a situation where, for example, you have 10 buildings built in a province, and you can't build the university despite the fact that you would technically have a build slot if it wasn't for a center of trade in the province. You can build the university in the macro builder, and it will take up a mythical 11th slot, because building things through the macro builder, if the building gives you +1 building slot, does actually allow you to build it, basically, even if you couldn't click on a tile to build it, allowing you to kind of build an off-map university as well. Same applies for all the other +1 building slots if built through the macro builder, but that's a separate, like, side issue, I guess, for lack of a better word. That said, universities, again, dev cost is amazing. My many reservations is how useful are they in single player? We're not really deving. My response to that is you're probably still deving institutions. And in single player, because you're not deving that much, you're probably not optimizing for deving as much as you would in multiplayer, meaning that you probably don't have as much dev cost reductions. And when you don't have a lot of dev cost reductions, a couple small dev cost reductions make a much bigger difference. So for that purpose, I think even universities within single player as a domain do incredibly well because of their ability to let you basically dev institutions as well and not have to worry about that. By the time they come around as well, you should be in a position you can actually use them. And again, they are just nice things to have. Thing is as well in single player is when you do get late after the game we have infinite money, there is pretty much no reason other than I guess not wanting to click too much to just sit down and build a university in every single one of your provinces. It increases the chance of spawning enlightenment as well as meaning that when the enlightenment does spawn, it spreads incredibly quickly through your land. So what's not to love about universities? So there we go. I mean, I personally love them, and it's going to be a bit of my personal bias showing through them, but I think if this was a purely single player tier list, it'll be a high B, low A tier. Because, okay, they're useful for dev institutions and for enlightenment, but not much beyond that. But in multiplayer especially, they're so dominant that I think they demand S tier just for the purpose of being their own thing. I'm sorry, 20% dev cost is just way too strong. With that though, we move on to workshops. This is a purely economic building. Unlike other things like temples, there is no secondary buffs you can put on workshops, like the development of temples. We'll get to that later. So you build this to make money, and it does that job quite well. Production efficiency at 50% locally and up to 100 at level at 24. I mean, it's just good. You're going to be able to get at least 0.1 ducats on most of these buildings, and this is the kind of building that you build to scale and you build to get, well, wealthier. But again, depends on your point of view of when you should pay it off. Even in single player though, I think it's worth building it because it's one of the nice things you can invest your money in to guarantee your country to actually function. Even if you are going ham and trying to conquer half the entire planet, it's still good to have an economy that can support advisors and your armies. And one of the ways that you can invest into that economy without, of course, wasting all your precious admin that you should be pouring or wasting all your precious dip that you spend on lawful demands is workshops. So it achieves that goal in single player, where it's great for your local economy, and it achieves that same goal in multiplayer as well, for basically, well, that's how you build up your economy so you can afford to fight. It's not, again, quite an S tier simply because of how demanding S tier is as a tier group for me at the moment, but especially given how early you get access to them, Admin Tech 6, you have basically the entire game ahead of you to make use of the workshops. An excellent building, and into A tier you go. With that said though, we move on to counting houses. It's a better workshop. Now it's a lot more expensive at 400 ducats for just another 50% marginal increase. However, at that point, the game's quite a bit later. You probably had time to build a manufacturer in the province as well. You probably devved it quite a bit if it's not, you know, that early on. If it's not like single player when you're not deving, I guess. Unfortunately, my issue with counting houses is, yes, they do make you a decent chunk more money. The problem is they come incredibly late at Admin Tech 24, so they're just going to be around for much less of the game for you to use up, even if you're going to Tech 32. Furthermore, by the time they are a thing in Tech 24, you either have sorted out money, where it's not a problem anymore, either in single player or in multiplayer, where you're now fighting about manpower, or if you are still worried about money, well, it's an upgrade, but it's quite a late one, and I mean, coal was just around the corner as well. So it's a very weird one in that regard. It's quite strong, it just, I think, comes way too late to be relevant a lot of the time for counting houses for me. So it's an excellent thing if a mission upgrades a workshop to a counting house. Otherwise, by the time you actually unlock them, it seems a bit too little too late in my opinion. But from a pure stats point of view, they are still quite strong and definitely quite nice to have. So into B tier they go. They're definitely not weak, but yeah, I can't be ranking them any higher than that. With that though, we move on to temples. Temples are a weird one. I'm going to be assuming that you're getting the dev cost from temple estates privilege for both single player and multiplayer. They're kind of like a workshop to the extent that you build them early on to get a bit of an economy. But I find that on average, temples are worse than workshops for squeezing money out of tags, unless you really have a lot of tags in your ideas. or you're someone like France who both has tax and has a lot of more tax dev than you normally would. So countries that have a lot of tax dev relatively are, just tend to be bigger tags overall. So smaller, tallish builds tend to not really have that much tax relatively. So again, countries like France, for example, are able to utilize temples very well. Thing is with temples as well is that if you are going to build around them for money, the estate edict for sorry, not the state, we'll get to the state edict either, but the I believe it's tier 4 or tier 5 reform temple rights, so you can basically get 33% extra tax out of temples, is quite good for getting a lot more money out of your temples, and I think the bumps them above workshops. And with dev costs on temple rights, I want dev costs on temples, you kind of end up in a weird situation where, I would basically say that temples do money worse than workshops and deving worse than unis. But in multiplayer especially, you kind of want to be doing both. So it's like, okay, you're a jack of all trades, so that means you'll be worse at, you're worse off doing two different things. But you still do both of them well enough. And there's nothing stopping you building temple, workshop, and, a manufacturer in the province if you're deving a multiplayer. So you kind of end up doing that. With that said, though, the thing is with temples is you can definitely see why they're deleted come late game. Tax dev really falls off. So there is not that much great late game potential in that regard. But for me, they really do shine in their early game, and especially for single player, I believe temples and workshops are one of the two economic buildings you actually bother building for a super sweaty try-hard run, where you're trying to conquer the world, if you're not just going full-on war economy by making money from punching out of people. So it's a weird one for me, is all I will say. Certainly weaker in multiplayer, in single player, but they make up for that by tax. You just kind of get that without having to work for it, unlike workshops for goods produced. And of course, they still come with a bit of dev cost that can help you dev an institution if you do end up taking temple rights. If you end up taking the development of temples estate privilege. So basically, yeah, it's good. It does fall off a bit, but it does what it needs early on, which is making money early on. And by late game, by the time it falls off, well, you don't really need the money from it. So it kind of, it does its job when it's new, when it has to. And by being around so incredibly early at Admin Tech 4, it's literally the first thing you unlock with Admin Tech. I think it's pretty much, just barely edging out workshops for me, but an A-tier building without too much question there. Anyway, we move on now to Cathedrals and Upgraded Temple. You're not going to make that much money out of them. By the time you get them on Admin Tech 19, you're not making that much money from tax, unless you've really built around tax, in which case you probably actually need the Cathedral money. It's nice when you can get it from a mission, like, for example, theocratic missions, things like for your countries, I believe, like Cologne or Trier, or small, like, HRE little tags like that. They tend to get a cathedral by just building a temple and upgrade it through their missions, so that's nice. The main thing is with cathedrals, of course, is in single player for doing a one faith, you shove a cathedral in every single province to get 3% missionary strength everywhere. So for that purpose alone, I think it's like nice because it's basically 3% missionary strength globally. If you have infinite money, you can convert that into 3% missionary strength. Beyond that, it's kind of especially in multiplayer. By the time you get to cathedrals, no one cares about tax. See, by the time you get to cathedrals, you should probably be deleting your temples, is the best way of putting it. Although, if you're keeping them around for the dev cost, I guess you can upgrade your cathedral if you really care about it. But for me, yeah, it's marginally kept reasonably alive in single player for specifically one tags for the local missionary strength. But it's such a pathetic increase in tax from 40 to 60%, and by the time you get it, it's really irrelevant. So, as much as it pains me to say, I'm sorry, the competition is just way too tough out here. You go into C tier and be happy you're not in D. You're being kept alive by that missionary strength. With that, though, we move on to Shipyards. Naval force limit. Local shipbuilding time. Ship repair. I build these to complete missions. Yeah, I guess if you're doing some kind of big naval up. I always get told by people like, oh, you're way too harsh on Navy, you end up making naval ranking things too low. But, EU4 as a game should prioritize naval things a lot more than it actually ends up doing. So naval things become an entire joke, and if you do need to win naval battles in single player, you just, win naval battles by the fact that the AI never upgrades their boats. So you just build up-to-date boats, and you're going to have so much quality in AI, you'll be fine and win everything. and just build more heavy ships is the long and short of it, right? In single player, you can very much brute force naval issues, right? You don't need to worry about quality or anything, and you just go over naval force summit, because by the time you need a navy to invade England or something, you should probably have Europe or things like that on lockdown. Topic of England. This is the other issue with doing naval. England is the problem with doing naval things in multiplayer. Because if you have an England player who's taking naval maritime, you've lost the naval fight. That's it, right? It's that's kind of the entire debate. England is so dominant within their naval buffs to whatever historical accuracy. I guess my issue being, of course, is that Paradox sees naval ideas and goes like, we need to buff them. How do we buff naval ideas? Oh, make them give stronger modifiers. To the point where if you've taken naval ideas, you win every single thing on the ocean. And if you haven't taken naval ideas, you lose everything to someone who has, irregardless of anything you can do about it. So it's a very weird situation. But this is more of an issue with naval combat and naval combat as a whole. And, well, shipyards don't exactly give you heavy ship combat ability or anything to that extent. They don't really achieve much apart from completing the odd mission when you need them. And even things that are naval, like, numbers based, in multiplayer you can make the argument for taking naval hegemon for artillery combat ability, artillery damage from back row. In single player you don't take naval hegemon. So it's just, yeah. I'm just going to put them into detail and move on from here. I can complain about naval problems in EU4 for multiple hours, but I feel like that's a video for another day. With that said, though, we move on to the Grand Shipyard. The Grand Shipyard is a reward I get for my missions for building the shipyard, and then I can move on and do the actual missions I want to do. Alright, there we go. Glad we got that one sorted. Now let's talk about the dock. The dock is a building I built to complete a mission, so I can move on and do the missions I actually want to do. Let's talk about the dry dock. The dry dock is the mission reward for building the dock. I take it so that I can then delete it and build a building I actually want. Excellent. Sorted? Excellent. Right. Now, marketplaces. It's a weird one. My issue with marketplaces is, again, it's almost like a building you build to complete missions or a building you build to complete estate agendas. They can be certainly good within certain situations, like, for example, if you are playing as England and you can't contest the mainland, so you need to contest the English Channel trade-wise, so you build a marketplace. Or you're playing as the Netherlands and you can't invade England, so you do the same thing. However, the optimal way of taking over the trade node is invading the trade node, right? And the optimal way of preventing other people stealing your trade is invading them. So marketplaces kind of fail in that regard. And the other thing is, of course, they only give you percentage local trade power. They don't actually increase your income in any way, so there's no real reason to ever build them for that case. I'd personally think marketplaces would be quite cool if they got given some local trade value, but that might be a bit too strong. I don't know, we'll have to fiddle with the numbers, but that's a separate thing. I'm not here to balance the buildings, I'm just here to rank them. Marketplaces are in a really weird spot for me in that regard. Like, the thing is, because they're unlocked so early, there are situations where it does make sense to build a marketplace. In a situation where the marketplace itself is a lot cheaper for squeezing out more trade value than it is to just invade your neighbors. Or, for example, in high AE environments, where, for example, you're competing for trade power in Lübeck, it makes sense to build a marketplace to get the trade power there, instead of entering a coalition with the entirety of Germany because you took 2 free cities, right? So, obviously, fighting the coalition the size of Germany for achieving a goal that could be achieved by building a marketplace, you build a marketplace to save yourself a coalition the size of Germany. However, that's kind of it. Like, given the limitations of the way that currently trade works, marketplaces are pretty irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, and again tend to be built just to complete random missions from whatever mission tree that you're currently following, and then they get upgraded to the next trade building. You're like, cool, and then move on with your life. These ones, however, unlike the upgraded grand shipyards and dry docks that I have to build, I tend to actually keep, because if you're not replace them with a different building, they are not, irrelevant. And I guess the same can be said for the shipyards. It's just, when are you really using sailors? Unless, of course, you're doing a very specific marine build, but shipyards, grand shipyards, and docks aren't exactly going to go up a tier because you're playing as England one time, right? But marketplaces, pretty much universally, even with single player and multiplayer, there are going to be situations where, because they're so early, it does make sense to build it. Otherwise, I feel like it's one of the traps with a lot of new players where they think, right, I need to make more money from trade. Ooh, I'm going to build marketplaces and invest more in that way. No, you make more money by trade by stabbing people that are taking your trade. Because when they're stabbed, they're not only are they not taking your trade, you're taking their trade. That's how trade works in EU4. You stab it until you have all of it, right? And marketplaces are just, like, it increases the amount of trade in the trade pool, but it doesn't really, alleviate the problem that someone's currently stealing your trade. So, yeah. That's kind of a limitation of the trade mechanic, but for me, marketplaces are just barely scraping their way into C tier because of their early game possibilities. Otherwise, yeah, pretty useless. Trade depots and stock exchanges, by the time you get them at Diptech 17 and 22, are both run into the same problems, right? For the trade depot, yeah, it's an upgrade to trade power. Yeah, you should be fine. You should be stabbing your enemies by Diptech 17. So into D tier you go. Same for stock exchanges. Excellent. Spend an extra 100 ducats upgrading a trade depot from 100% local trade power to 125%. Why? Right? Like, it's... Yeah. That's the best way of saying it. I feel like stock exchanges exist to be a mission reward for like, ooh, get a super high level trade building early. Yeah. Sorry. Into D tier you go. Speaking of D tier, we're now talking about coastal defenses. If someone's playing a Pirate Republic, you can build coastal defenses in multiplayer. If you're in single player and getting raided, just kill the person raiding you. Saves you a building slot. It's probably going to cost you less than 100 ducats, you know, to... Because if you think about it, let's say you have a big coastline, you're getting navally raided and it's annoying you. You could spend 1,000 ducats building coastal defenses in like 10 provinces and prevent yourself getting raided. Or you can spend 200 ducats investing in like a navy, or probably up to say 500, and invading the pirates. And instead of having to waste all those new dip slots, or all those building slots and coastal defenses, you've instead gained new land and prevented all your coastline being raided. Thanks. Absolutely amazing. Yeah. Really filling out D tier today. With that though, we move on to naval batteries. There is a use I have to mention for multiplayer. A lot of people don't realize they do give +5 hostile fleet attrition. That was one of the patches that kind of happened and then people moved on because who cares about naval batteries? But they do. So if you're fighting someone like in England as France and they're blockading you because they're annoying because they know that if they land you then they get slaughtered, you can basically drain their sailors by just putting down a couple naval batteries and then just, you know, continue to ignore the British blockade. That's kind of the way things happen. And eventually you're going to start draining a lot of their sailors. It's a bit of an uphill battle, especially against countries like England. But if it's a situation of, let's say, a Morocco versus Spain fight, or something like a... I'm trying to think of another, like, over the sea, like an Italy into Tunis battle or something come late game. Basically, yeah, areas around the Mediterranean, or let's say the Ottomans got killed by Mamluks in Hungary. So they're now separated by the Constantinople Straits. I've got the names of those. I think that's the... That's not... Is that the Bosphorus? Oh, God, I completely forgot the name of that strait, but it's the Turkish Straits. You know the one I mean, between the one that Istanbul, Constantinople sits on those. Basically, if one of the sides are blockading the one there, you can throw down a naval battery and start, you know, attriting away their manpower. Beyond that very, very specific case, you should never build these in single player. You should never build these in multiplayer. Excellent. Glad we got that sorted. Now let's move on to armies. Barracks. In single player, if you're struggling with manpower, you should build these. In multiplayer, if you're not building this, that's one of the things you should do to improve. Build barracks. They come out quite early to the extent that you tend to unlock them before you kind of have a country built up enough to afford building them. They are 100 ducats each. So you shouldn't like immediately fill up your country the moment that you take up barracks, probably because doing so would make you bankrupt. Because it's just no Tech 6. But you know, you get them early enough to be incredibly relevant, and they are excellent at doing their job. For single player, again, if you're struggling with manpower, you should build them. If you're not struggling with manpower, then of course they're relevant. In multiplayer, you should build them so that you can maintain your big long wars, right? For the multiplayer, easy yes tier. For single player, they do their job. It's just, in single player, you can not struggle with manpower if you're not being an idiot with your troops and not leaving them to attrition in the middle of Tibet. Now, I've left my troops to attrition in the middle of Tibet. You've probably left your troops to attrition in the middle of Tibet. I bet you if you open up a random save inside your EU4 save game folder where you're trying to go for a world conquest and you've got around half of it, I'm going to find a stack of troops attrition in Tibet, right? That's a pretty reasonable thing. We're all human, right? We all just like go invade Russia at one point, then take our troops home, and then 100 years later when we're invading Russia again, we realize we've got a black flagged army up in Siberia. Not really sure how it survived that long, but it's been draining our manpower the entire time. If that sounds like you, you're probably going to build some barracks to try and recover the manpower that you're losing. If, however, you're being on top of your armies and micromanaging and being a good, being a good little micromanager in that regard, you can definitely not struggle with manpower within World Conquest single player campaigns, right? So that's just the reality of the situation, I guess. However, again, it's a quality of life thing almost. Spam these buildings, you don't have to worry about them. So for me, yeah, A tier. Go in there and be happy. With that though, we move on to the training fields, the upgrade of the barracks. Same S tier placement for the single player. Sorry, for the multiplayer. For single player, again, much like barracks, they solve the exact same problem, just better. The demands for manpower are like money. They don't go down later on. You're still doing fighting. If anything, you're doing even more fighting. So it's not like you ever have too much manpower. If you have too much manpower, that just means you can go more over forcement and fight more aggressively, right? So it's a kind of a weird problem. And if you do have too much manpower and you're fine on it, just don't build it, you're fine. Right, for single player. Multiplayer, of course, it's S tier, so again, much like points like the barracks. So in a very similar way, and I'm going to be putting them in A tier, and by being around by Tech 16, they aren't too late where they're irrelevant. They're not like any Grand Shipyards Tech 24, or something stupid like that. Anyway, with that, we move on to regimental camps. Again, a multiplayer S tier classic. However, for me, regimental camps are also just excellent to do in single player. Why? Well, military hegemon. You want to get to 1 million troops. Regimental camps are how you get to that amount, right? That's a massive boost towards it. You get them quite early on, to the extent whereby, you know, they are quite expensive at 200 ducats each. However, you know, you do get them early on, so if you're really scaling your economy, you can start building them. If you can't afford them, that's okay. It's just more on those things that you can really invest in yourself to squeeze out more things from you in the late game. And again, in single player, they're beautiful because they let you get to Mo Hegemon faster. So yeah, I think that's enough said there. In multiplayer, they're amazing. In single player, absolutely as well, because they get you to Mo Hegemon. Go into S tier and be happy. With that though, we move on to Conscription Centres. The upgrade comes quite late, I find, by Tech 22, so it kind of falls off in the sense that if you are going for Mil Hegemon and you're blobbing and you're campaigning for it, you've probably already hit it by that point. It can help you to get more Force Summit too, but the thing is, I find that by Tech 22, especially in single player, you can just afford to go over Force Summit. Multiplayer, there's still an S tier thing, but even in multiplayer, you're starting to run to the issue that the games run quite late by the time you get to them. By Tech 22, a lot of campaigns are starting to be over. Like, the late game fighting is Miltech 16 to like 20 fighting, and anything past like 20 Tech 22 onwards is definitely super late game by MP standards, because MP campaigns just do not last past the 1700s really. So it kind of falls off in my opinion just because of how late it is, and the single player viability of it. If you are going for Miller Hegemon, I mean it helps you get there eventually, but like you should be there by now for me. So it's a bit of a weird one, again, just because of how late it is. I mean, if I was to judge it completely honestly, I have to admit that, like, yeah, it's still really good, and in multiplayer, if you do get around to actually building it, you should. But at the same time, it's quite late, so it's a bit of a weird one in the rankings. And the single player, again, value of it really drops down for me. If it was a purely single player tier list, I'd actually putting it down to C tier for me, I believe, because, again, it's just by that point, by this late in the game, you should have Mil Hegemon. But multiplayer, it's just too good for multiplayer. So you know what? Go into the top of B tier and go be happy with your placements, you Conscription Centres. Anyway, with that, moving on to forts. Now, when I started playing this game, I started taking it a lot more seriously. One of the things that I would do was delete forts because they'd cost you too much money. I still do that, but then I actually check the terrain those forts are on. Farmland forts, yeah, they can go. I like to keep capital forts because funny lot when having a fort on your capital. Beyond that, it's a weird one. Forts are just really unique in the function that they serve as buildings. However, I am going to take this as an opportunity to make a PSA. One of the nice things with forts is a lot of people, especially in single player, complain that their AI runs around their country sieging out all of their little things, and it's really annoying because they're trying to catch 1k stacks randomly sieging them out. Do you know what the solution to that is? A fort line, right? That is the solution to that problem. Meanwhile, in multiplayer, if you don't have any forts, you're going to lose 2 battles and get it completely occupied. In essence, if you're playing the game in any reasonable way, they're either amazing for quality of life for preventing little AIs running around, or preventing rebels, because if they occupy a province without any fort next to it, they're going to immediately spawn separatism reductions. If it's like, for example, religious zealots, they're going to immediately convert the province. But if they're within the zone of control of a fort, that's not going to apply. So, amazing for single-player quality of life. An absolute necessity in multiplayer. It's just yeah, these guys are good. Do not neglect forts. And yeah, of course you should delete bad forts in like farmlands and grasslands. But a good mountain fort is worth its weight in gold, sometimes quite literally. So yeah, I mean, I think it's way too unique and is way too amazing quality of life wise for, well, even within multiplayer, because again, you're probably still going to get the rebels in multiplayer. Go and send to S tier and be happy about it, forts. God damn it, can't believe I'm putting forts in S tier. After all the forts I've deleted. Truly an ironic placement, but I guess that's what you get for being pretty much the most unique building out of all of them. With that said though, we move on to our manufactories. This is a fun list. So the first one is the farm estate, can be built on grain, livestock and wine. I don't like this menu. Like, I'd build it if I really have like money right now and I really want to squeeze out more income. But you get it super early, which is a blessing and a curse, because you can never really afford menus by Tech 6. Like, very few countries, and I'm talking very few, like countries like Ming or Ottomans, are the only countries that can really afford a farm estate by, so an entire 500 ducat manufactory, sorry, by admin Tech 6, right? Like, even countries like France have better things to spend 500 ducats on, like, you know, stabbing the Spanish or something, than a farm estate for usually like what 0.2 gets produced. The other issue, of course, with farm estates is they take up grain, livestock, and wine. So it's like, okay, you're getting a bit more money out of it, but if you're struggling with manpower, you're better off building a soldiers' households. So you're kind of like using up a manu slot for that. So it's a bit of a weird one for me on that regard. At the end of the day, though, there's some manufactories, so if you throw a farm estate in Australia, by the time you get all the trades through to the English Channel, that farm estate is going to be printing like, you know, 10 ducats or something worth of trade value. So absolutely worth it in those cases, of course, but that's, you know, like, yeah, if you work really hard for it, it can be really good. But compared to all the other economy manufactories, I mean, it comes early, but it's just really weak when it does arrive, and it arrives so early you can't really tend to use it. Like, you don't really have that much money early on to spend on manufacturers for me. So yeah, farm estates, I'm sorry, you're just too awkward. Still better than all the naval things, but go into C tier and be happy about it. With that though, we move on to the ramparts. Who doesn't like a little line of ramparts? Absolutely got nerfed though, you can't build them on mountains anymore. Rampart mountains used to be an amazing way of messing with people. In fact, one of my favorite things, technically an Ambernar moment, was shoving ramparts inside a dwarven hold. Not sure if you can still do that. I don't know if dwarven holds count as terrain. That's definitely an Ambernar question. It's been a while since, I don't think I've played dwarves actually since the update, but that's a separate thing for Ambernar. I'm still waiting for that planned dwarven like empire rework. But anyway, that's completely unrelated to the actual question. Ramparts used to be amazing because you could put them on mountains and things. Now you can only put them on flat terrain, so it's a bit awkward because you're like, all right, great, I can take a farmland and turn it into a forest for 500 ducats. Or I could build a fort in a forest and save myself 500 ducats in a manu slot. Amazing. An attrition for enemies and local defensiveness from Ramparts also doesn't, like, hurt, but you can also pick up the same attrition for enemies by being in a mountain. Well, not the attrition, but basically the local defensiveness from being in a mountain. Then the attrition for enemies, just, if you're really stacking that, defensive kind of gets you 80% of the way there, right? Especially with things like a mild winter or a harsh winter, right? So if you're stacking attrition for enemies and those kinds of builds, and you are trying to fort every single province, yeah, you should build ramparts, but they've really got nerfed after not being able to put them in amazing mountainous defensive positions. Which kind of makes sense, because in multiplayer that was definitely an amazing way of trolling with people. But I'm here to judge current ramparts, not past ramparts. And current ramparts, because they cannot be built in mountains, are going to be going to C tier. I'm sorry. Can't really justify anything above that. With that though, we move on to impression officers. Naval buffs. I can get more sailors and local shipbuilding time and local ship cost. I don't care. I really hope for EU5 naval like things actually matter, but until they do, go sit in D tier and be happy. I mean, just be happy that I'm going to move on now and not keep bullying you for being useless. With that said though, we move on to naval equipment manufactories. This is the Tech 11 manufacturing line, naval equipment, textiles and weapons. You're getting +1 goods produced now on At least for the textile and weapons one, good things. So copper and iron are good things to get +1 goods produced on. Cloth, dyes, silk, and, well, cloth, dyes, and silk are also great things to get goods produced on. Wool a bit less so. Wool falls more into the grain, fish, naval supply side of things. But hey, naval equipment manufacturers can build them on salt. That's a decent one as well. Good, comparable to cloth as far as manufacturers go. Yeah, these are good. These are the backbone of your economy. You definitely need to combine them with workshops to really get the maximum amount of value out of them. And you definitely need to have your trade sorted out so you're not losing trade value from it. But that +1 local goods produced gives you goods produced on the province, so it's basically 5 free dip clicks on that. And don't forget that goods produced also contributes to the trade value of the trade node you're in. So again, just wins all around. Absolute workhorses. You build them in single player if you're really struggling for money and want to invest in your economy. You absolutely build them in multiplayer. But yeah, it's nothing too amazing. These things are like the backbone of your economy in the sense that they will build it up, but unlike something like temples and workshops, they aren't exactly giving you that super early boost that you can use to really squeeze that money out of, right? So it's a bit of a weird one for me in that regard. And of course, the high entry level cost of 500 ducats each before the modifiers can be quite expensive too. Although again, if it's multiplayer, by that point you've probably expanded administration a couple of times, you probably grab construction costs from an idea or two, and so on and so on. But still, even then, that's quite a hefty price tag to charge for them. So for me, they're definitely very much the naval equipment, the textile and the weapons are very much the workhorse manufacturers. If I had to rank between them, I will be putting textile in the top, then weapons, then the naval equipment manufacturing. Simply because of its ability to be built on salt, and fish and naval supplies isn't great, but hey, it's not awful as far as, well, fish is, sorry, but naval supplies is. It's not awful to build an equipment manufacturer on, so it is what it is. So yeah, that's the placement for it, and that's the workhorse buildings. You have to respect them. With those ones done though, we move on to state houses. You should absolutely be building these on paper, glass, and gems. If not, you should be building them anyway on any province inside your empire. In multiplayer, again, it's a possible number of buildings, so it covers itself basically. And in single player, if you build state houses on your paper, glass, and gems spread throughout the world, you're gonna mostly be able to mitigate statewide governing costs combined with courthouses, because 40% and 50% from the town halls, are additive. So you pay minus 90% statewide governing cost. So you can pretty much 10x your empire before you start getting into GovCap issues. Absolutely beautiful. By the time you unlock them at Admin 12, you're probably not having that many GovCap issues. And if you are having GovCap issues, you probably can't afford to throw down 500 ducat manufacturers everywhere. So it's a bit of a weird one. By the time you are, however, running into GovCap issues, and by the time you have the money to afford them, though, you've already unlocked them. So for me, that's just a good thing. You're not blocked by the time to unlock for me. So yeah, there we go. And don't forget the flat minus 20 province governing cost that comes from them as well. Absolutely beautiful. The minimum local autonomy, I've seen some talks about basically utilizing that to squeeze out minimum local autonomy on trade company areas and so on like that. I tend to not bother personally for GovCat for the trade companies. In that case, I think it's just better to go for stating the entire world. But there definitely is a run there to be made from just state housing all of your trade company land and starting to stack minimum autonomy in territories as well. Anyway, that's a separate debate for another day. With that though, yeah, paper, glass, gems, make sure you shove a state house in those. You're not going to regret it. Anyway, that's state houses. Their ability to basically remove GovCap as an issue earns them a rightful spot in S tier. So go in there and be happy. After that though, we move on to the Tech 14 to 16 manufacturers. So let's talk about the Tech 14 ones now, the plantations and trade stations. This is the goods produced on the good stuff. On the cocoa, on your cotton, on your coffee, on your sugar, your tea and your tobacco. Yeah, it's the good stuff. And the trade stations, especially on your cloves, on your incense, your ivory, your furs. Now, of course, there's some bad ones. Slaves suck. Slaves are terrible. You should never invest in them, like, at all. I mean, they go up to 3 ducats by the time the Portuguese figure out triangles, but then drop back down again. It's just, yeah, ban slavery as soon as you can. You want to replace it with actual trade goods, actually good trade goods like ivory. With that said, though, yeah, it is what it is. Similar things can be said about tea, but at least tea is moderately useful because it gives you advisor costs when you're trading in it. So plantations on tea can help you get there. And, tobacco is actually worse than money, but yeah. Basically, Slaves are the odd ones out here, but yeah. Plantations and trade stations, great for printing money. They do come a bit late though, annoyingly, because they come by Tech 14, and I find that Tech 11, Tech 12, Tech 13 is about the time you can start looking at building menus up and building up your country. From personal experience, depends of course on the country you're playing and how well you're doing. If you're playing in Italy, you're probably able to afford manufactories by Tech 5 after all, but you know, that's just Italy things. And if you're playing inside like central Tibet, you're probably not able to afford manufactories by Tech 20. Although again, the optimal way of playing central Tibet is leaving central Tibet and conquering somewhere like China that can afford manufactories by Tech 14. Anyway, I digress. These things are good. And unlike the aforementioned previous ones that we mentioned here, most of the ones that you're building on here, like the cocoa, the cloves, your ivory, your spices, your coffee, your cotton, tend to be a bit better than your things like your cloth, cotton, and iron, but they're honestly pretty comparable with each other. So you can like make a case for a super high placement, but for me they are still within the domain of just workhorse manufacturers. So I will be putting both of them above the other three, with trade stations coming in below Plantations, because I think Plantations have a slightly better spread, but cloves trade stations are a hell of a drug. With that said though, yeah, that's kind of it for those two. We will move on to the soldiers households. If you have manpower issues, build them, and manpower issues will go away, especially for single player. For multiplayer, you should be building them anyway. So in multiplayer, they're S tier because you need to build them everywhere. For single player, if you have manpower issues, they make the manpower issues go away, much like barracks. So yeah, it's they are very much within that domain. I think it's safe to put it in a very similar slot to the barracks, maybe just above it, because they solve that exact same problem. Soldiers' households better, but of course they charge you more money for the process. And they do arrive by Tech 15, so a bit late. With that though, we move on to mills. Absolute beautiful goods produced things affecting your Chinaware, your gems, your glass, your paper. Wonderful trade goods. The exact same thing, we've already talked about those menus before. So into the high B tier you go. I'm going to probably put you above Plantations. But honestly, again, this grouping here are pretty interchangeable. And finally, we get to furnaces. Furnaces, by the time you get them, you probably don't care about money because you've solved the economy. However, they are literally the only building that gives you a national modifier for each one that you build in your country, which is quite amazing. And as I've argued before, and I will argue again in the trade goods because I am willing to die on this hill, coal is incredibly, incredibly powerful. Coal is how you break the game. Coal, if you ever want to stack overflow income, you achieve that by getting, coal furnaces, right? And yes, people do make runs where they stack overflow income. This is an actual thing, for those unaware. And yeah, for that you need coal. If you are struggling with economy and you are, shall we say, newer to the game, you're also going to want to build coal because it's going to fix your economy. It is genuinely just that good, right? Let's not forget that England is meant to represent its massive economic wealth. Well, one of its buffs is the 20% goods produced. And Germany, being the industrial, powerhouse of the world, gets 20% goods produced as well. That's just 4 furnaces, right? Just 4 coal provinces is enough to be equivalent to England in terms of its economic prowess. But there we go, that's not too much said there. Does it arrive absolutely late? Yes. Is the Tech 21 requirement for coal deceptive? Oh, absolutely, because even though you unlock furnaces Tech 21, you still need the Enlightenment. So it comes much later than that, than, just what it would give to. But yeah, it's amazing. And again, it's a global modifier from a local building. I'm going to be putting it into S tier, and that's the hill I'm willing to die on. With that said, though, we've completed the tier list for the most part. I'm going to scroll up a bit so you can see it a bit better. Let's for those that just skipped to the end, let me zoom in a bit so you can just, there we go, see it in its all its full glory. But there we go. Right, I think everything that needed to be said has been said. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the editing so far with the little description of what the buildings are doing and so on, please do let me know. That would be appreciated. But yeah, that is all I have time for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.